Richard, thank you as ever for all your support for the Orwell Youth Prize, and it's a real pleasure today to be able to talk to you about your memories of your father.
Not at all.
Why the name George Orwell?
Back in the 1930s, it was suggested, but he wanted to protect himself from his family, so he wasn't going to write under the name of Eric Blair. And his publisher.
Was that because of him having to sort of?
Well, I think his parents were a bit disappointed that he gave up his job as a policeman in Burma, came home, resigned his commission, and wanted to be a writer. And I think his father, being very middle class, and thought that wasn't really a proper career. So he decided that he'd gone off and started writing. He'd gone into London and done all sorts of things. So he decided that he would have to protect his family, he would change his name. And one of the names that came up was George Orwell. The reason for that was simply George was a very common Christian name, and it was also the name of the king. River Orwell, which ran through Ipswich, wasn't very far from Southwold, where his parents lived, so he just put the two together, and he called himself George Orwell. But it was never officially adopted, so it is not. It wasn't legally adopted as a name.
It was just a pen name.
Just a pen name.
So I think one of the things about your father having such a strong legacy is that people often come forward with relics, and I think one of his former publications used to raffle off a genuine Orwell stapler every Christmas. Have you brought anything along today?
Yes, well, as far as I know, I can't authenticate it, but I'm fairly certain that this wristwatch belonged to my father. The reason for that is that Sonia gave it to me when I was about 8 or 9, I think, or 10. And so as far as I know, she just said, this was your father's watch, which I'm giving it to you now. So that is the only providence that I can put forward to say that it's a genuine article. It's an American service watch.
Vernon Richards, a friend of your father and photographer, took some memorable photographs around that time.
Yes, he did. The reason why that came about was that by this time, Animal Farm had been published, and his publisher had decided that he needed some publicity shots. So he engaged Vernon Richards, who came along. He was not essentially a photographer, but photography was he was an amateur photographer. And he, over a period of about 2 or 3 days, took a whole lot of publicity shots, which are the photographs that we see even today. These are the ones that we see. If there's anything about George Orwell in the papers, these are the photographs that are used.
Do you want to talk about some of your favourite ones of those photographs? Because you appear in quite a few of them.
Well, yes. I suppose I probably appeared in 2/3 of all the photographs that were ever taken. The photograph, of course, which we are all familiar with, and I'll show you this one, of course, is in fact the one of my father. And if there's ever a publicity photograph in papers, any sort of publication of today, this is probably one of them. Not the only one, but one of them. The one that I quite like is I'm watching my father making something for me. He was an amateur carpenter, and he liked to make little toys for me. And you can see he's working at his workbench, and there's a small head down the bottom left-hand corner, which is little Richard watching him making something and wondering whether he could play with the tools sitting on the workbench, which he disliked intensely for 2 reasons. One, because you don't play with the workman's tools, and secondly, I'd probably cut my fingers off.
So what took you to Jura?
My father had been making arrangements to go up to Jura, or had been to Jura, at the behest of his great friend David Astor. And the Astors had an estate on the island of Jura.
And Astor was the editor?
He was the editor of The Observer. He could have had an estate on any of the Scottish islands. It wouldn't have mattered. The fact it happened to be Jura. And my father went to Jura, quite liked it, and decided that he would like to move there and rented a house, a farmhouse. The reason for that was really so that he could settle down and start writing what turned out to be 1984. Animal Farm had been published. It yielded sufficient funds for him to be able to take time off from his journalism, and he wanted to get away from London. Terribly grey, he said, very grey and austere. And so Jura is where he moved to, and I followed him very soon afterwards, and in the, I think, late summer of 1946.
What were your memories of your life on Jura?
Well, Jura was a wonderful island for a small child. Complete and utter freedom. These are little snapshots. We would sit in the dining room, have lunch, and he was a very heavy smoker. It was what one called black shag. It was almost like pipe tobacco, which he would put into a roll-up. And he would throw his cigarette ends into the fireplace in the dining room. And I would obviously have my lunch and I would be finished. So I would get down. And I found an old pipe in the garden. So I thought, I know what I want to do. I will go into the fireplace, take the cigarette ends out, take the tobacco out and stuff them in the pipe. Oh, which I did. I then asked for a lighter. And my father, without a break in the conversation, produced the lighter, handed it down behind the chair, and I tried to light this pipe. Even then, I thought, they don't seem to know what I'm doing. They can't see me. They can't see me. So I lit this pipe, with the inevitable consequence, of course, was that I was violently ill. This put me off smoking, at least until I got to school.
Were you conscious, obviously, while writing 1984, Orwell was also quite ill with TB, tuberculosis. Were you conscious of that? I wasn't conscious of the fact that he had TB. I was conscious of the fact that he was ill, yes. And I would say, where does it hurt, Daddy? And eventually in 1947, after I think he was more or less done the first draft of 1984, he did take ill. He was bringing up blood. And it was suggested that he should go to hospital. So he went to a place called the Hare Myers Hospital in East Kilbride, outside Glasgow, where he was given streptomycin. Now, streptomycin was something very new, and it had to be obtained from America. And David Astor stepped in and managed to get permission from the Home Secretary to import streptomycin. And he was given shots of this antibiotic. Unfortunately, he was allergic to it. And halfway through the course, he just reacted violently to it. He got blisters on his lips, his fingernails fell out, and it really didn't do him any good at all. So they had to stop halfway through the treatment. So anyway, he did come home. He was better. He came home and he finished writing 1984 in 1948, and by the end of the year he had a relapse. He couldn't find anybody to come and type out his rough draft, and he said it's a terrible state, a terrible mess, and but somehow there was nobody who couldn't find anybody to come and type, so he did it himself. And by the end of 1948 he was in real medical trouble, and it was suggested that he really should go down and be close to London as possible. And that's when he moved down to, in January 1949, moved down to Cranham Sanatorium in Gloucestershire. Mm. He was there until the autumn of 1949. Then he moved to University College London, where he remarried, having lost his Eileen in 1945, remarried to Sonia Brunel, who had been Cyril Connolly's secretary. Sadly, of course, in January 1950, when he was getting ready to go to Switzerland to recuperate, he had a massive hemorrhage during the night and drowned in his own blood. How did you hear about your father's death?
Very, very strangely, it was in fact announced on the 8 o'clock news on the home service of BBC. Home service was what would be called Radio 4 now, but it was called home service in those days. And at the 8 o'clock news, the newsreader said that, how did he put it? Today we announced the death of George Orwell, Eric Arthur Blair, the author of Animal Farm 1984, who died in the early hours of the morning, or has died. And this was the first time we heard of it. I mean, I was presumably up and about and listening to the news with Avril and Bill, which of course caused all sorts of problems because obviously this was the first time they knew as well. And Avril had to make very, very hasty arrangements to get off the island, get down to London to attend to his funeral.
When did you first read your father's work?
I suppose it was, I became aware of the fact that he was a writer. It was sort of an organic development as I grew older. So his name became, was being mentioned more and more. There was like a TV play back in 1954 of 1984. And there were obviously with his books in the house. And I think I first read my father's work when I was the age of 12, which was Animal Farm. And obviously thoroughly enjoyed it. Did I understand it fully? I probably read it more as a story, as opposed to something a political underlying theme. And I'd thought, well, I'll move on to 1984. I was actually, funny enough, my Uncle Bill suggested I should perhaps wait a couple of years before reading it. Once I'd read it, which I waited till I was a little older, once I'd read it, then I started to go and read all the other.
Do you think the political climate, for instance, the Cold War, influenced your father's reputation in any way?
Well, you see, of course, obviously, I was at my age. I came up through the Cold War, and as the young people today don't see the Cold War as we saw it. It was very much black and white, I suppose, if you look back at it. America versus Russia, and each looking at each other, wondering who was going to press the button. Now it's changed. The climate is much more complex. We now have a third element in here of terrorism, which is the problem with terrorism. Of course, it is not confined to a country. It is like the tentacles of a virus spreading out into the world. So it's more amorphous in the sense that you can't pin it down. And that is the terrifying thing, of course, today, is that you can't just simply go in and snuff it out, because you can't. The fire just springs up all over.
What do you think about the Orwell Youth Prize?
I think it's an excellent thing to promote. Is the one thing that will try and get young people to think and to learn how to sit down and write an essay, a continuous piece of work, and to allow their thoughts to come forward and to think about what's going on. The one thing that my father said, if anything, freedom is the right to say something that other people don't want to hear. And that was one of his mantras. And it's absolutely true that we're getting to the stage where this is happening. And we must allow young people to stop, think, and write.
What do you think Orwell can teach anyone who might be thinking of entering the Youth Prize or interested in writing?
For the Youth Prize, I think is just sit down and think of just write about something. Let your mind go. Don't be cramped by what's going on around you, what you might see or read in the papers or getting from your iPhone. Just sit down, think about what's going on in the world and try and put it in words. Doesn't matter. It'll come eventually, or might not, as the case may be. Doesn't really matter. We're not all destined to write, but just to sit down and think and just put down, say a few words. And that's what we're trying to encourage with young people.
Richard, thank you.
Not at all, and long may the